Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening, it may not look it outside in late February, but it's going to be the case in any case that spring comes along. A lot of changes are going to happen in the ecosystem very soon and very powerfully. Humans don't have a whole lot to say about that. It's on a cycle that's well beyond our control. But there are a lot of other changes that are likely to come up too in this season, in part because humans start to do very different things when seasons change. And there's a brand new set of conditions that we're all facing now, as well as a new combination of people in institutions that we haven't had combined before. Particularly here in this neck of the woods and at Harvard, where there's a new president coming into a new spring with a new class of students and a new set of demands that usually get put forward in what's known as Harvard Heat Week. Harvard Heat Week is when students actually get themselves focused on the fact that climate change is an extraordinarily impending problem for their entire future. So we're going to look this week at what's coming in Harvard's Heat Week 2019. A new season, as I say, new students, a new sense of urgency around the world, if not yet at Harvard, and we have a new president. Does it all add up to a new divestment policy? Well, that's what we can ask ourselves and look into this week. Well, the new season's got to come along, and obviously this is not a picture from today or yesterday or the day before. It has to do with what's coming along in the next season, and you can ask yourself, okay, what is coming? The answer is a new season that's going to look pretty gorgeous. Given all the rainfall we've had, we're going to have such blossoms that have not been repeated in other years. It's going to be amazing in that respect. What's coming? Well, new students are here this time around. Different from the spring of 2015. We have in the spring of 2019, 4 years later, a brand new group of students. By new, I mean to say that there are none of them overlapping with the undergraduates from 2015. Current seniors were not even on campus yet as freshmen. So this is an entirely new group of students in respect to civil disobedience in reference to climate change on campus. And it's going to be very interesting to see whether that makes any difference. Current seniors were not yet on campus for the dramatic events of 2015, and they therefore have no memory of them. The question is whether there's any sort of intergenerational transmission of wisdom from one student group to the next. Whether the students that are alive and active this spring remember is not quite the word, but can recall anything that was left to them as a kind of heritage from previous students. Well, what can we learn from the way Harvard treated its students in the past? You may recall that Cambridge Community Television held several reporting episodes on what was happening at the time, and while Stanford divested itself of coal, Harvard turned around and arrested its students for asking the same thing. Harvard students were out en masse on the old campus, or what amounts to the yard, and were saying to the president, who was then Drew Faust, and to the members of the corporation, it's time to get out of fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, and petroleum. But when one of them got in the way of the Harvard police, they arrested him and took him off to trial. While Stanford, which has a center established by Mobil to look at climate change, actually realized that no, they should be divesting from all the coal that they had in their portfolio, and they did so rather publicly. With a new set of students, though, the real question is, will we repeat the same kind of sense of urgency that was expressed in 2015 by student leaders like Timothy Christopher? It's worth remembering what he said out in front of the president's office. Take a look.
Throughout our long and proud history of social movements in this country, religious communities and communities of faith have been the backbone of a lot of those movements. And if we wish to be that backbone for this movement today, we cannot divorce the prophetic work of justice from what Andrea Gibson calls the terrible manners of truth. Because there are some terribly inconvenient truths that need to be spoken in this campaign and about Harvard. When this campaign began a few years ago, the students were fundamentally asking Harvard to be a leader on climate justice, to take the leadership of standing up against the fossil fuel industry, to be leaders that change our political and our economic systems. And Harvard responded by saying that they do care about climate change, and that they are responding, and that they're working on engineering solutions, they're working on scientific solutions, they've even got some discussions about policy going on. And they said that this is the job of universities, this is what universities do. So essentially their response to the most unprecedented global crisis is to say, this is what we always do. We're going to keep doing the thing that we always do in the face of an unprecedented crisis. But that's not moral leadership. That's the same old bullshit that got us into this mess. And we ask for leadership, not the same old bullshit. So we should look into exactly what it is that they're doing. They like to celebrate the work being done over across the quad there at the Harvard Center for the Environment, which is almost entirely funded by Bank of America. Now, yesterday we heard from a woman from South Africa that Bank of America is the primary funder of new coal mines in South Africa. Where I'm from in West Virginia, Bank of America has been the primary funder of mountaintop removal coal mining. So when they celebrate that the work that is going on over there, they're saying, yes, we're willing to talk about the environment within the constraints of what is convenient to Bank of America. But that's not leadership. That's the same old bullshit. And we ask for leadership, not the same old bullshit. And we should look at who's in that Center for the Environment. It's Director Dan Schrag, who, as many of us know, is a very outspoken opponent of divestment. He says he cares about climate change, but divestment just isn't the way to get it done. But in addition to working for Harvard, in addition to advising the President of the United States, Dan Schrag also works for C12 Energy to promote their natural gas power plants. Dan Schrag also works for SCS Energy to promote their carbon capture and sequestration plant burning coal in California. So while he says that divestment isn't really the way to go, he's not just an objective scientist, he's an employee of the natural gas and the coal industry. He takes about $10,000 a month from SCS Energy to promote their coal-fired power plant. So we should be calling that out, that that's not leadership on climate change. That's the same old bullshit of representing the fossil fuel industry.
Well, you can't get much more explicit than that. In 2015, a sense of frustration, a sense of the lack of leadership among the university's highest officials, the president, the corporation, and in fact the leader of the environment program at Harvard. Well, what's coming now? There is still now a new sense of urgency that is beginning to emerge, and it's worth listening to it when you get a chance. Bill McKibben is saying things almost on a daily basis now that can be picked up off of Transition Studies or elsewhere, and it goes way back to Severin Suzuki, who put this very clearly in 1992. This is almost 30 years ago now. It's actually 27 years ago, and it's still counting. In a way, there has been a new surge among the very youngest about this. And the real question is, can the grown-ups catch up and catch on to what the youth has been saying? They've been telling them, in effect, don't strike from the schools, go back to the schools. We need you to learn. And the kids are saying, well, listen, we go to the schools, what we're going to learn is that we have no future. So they're putting the question, should we go back to school to learn that it's already too late for us to have a future? Well, this 15-year-old started a new strike and tradition of school strikes within our own country in Sweden, but then it extended to the EU in Brussels, and she began to speak, turned 16, and began to speak in a number of different places, like the Conference of Parties back in Poland in December 2018, and in Davos after that. And she inspired a whole group of European students to get out on the streets and strike their school systems.
A record 30,000 school children and students swamped Brussels city centre, braving the rain and snow to demand action on climate change. They're using the only leverage they have, school attendance, to urge leaders to act. It's the third week in a row that students have skipped class to protest, and it's the biggest crowd yet.
This is really incredible. This is really a movement, a generation that is standing up. This cannot be ignored.
We're here to march for the climate, as it's the only way for us young people to make our voices heard. We don't have the means that the government has, and since they're not doing it, we're getting on with it, doing everything we can.
Doing everything we can because the governments are doing nothing. That's a pretty amazing set of movements way beyond the school system, certainly beyond the university. This is way before the university. And when NASA scientists are wondering how to get the urgency across, they laugh about it a lot and joke,
No offense,
but they have no idea.
Scientist. Dr. Marvel, I think the question here is how do you explain the urgency to Americans, right? That has been, I think, the challenge, and I think it came through during the Michael Bloomberg interview. Explain the urgency of what we're facing.
Oh my gosh, I wish I knew. I wish I had a good answer for this, because as scientists, what we want to do, what we're always tempted to do, is show more data and more graphs. Like there's going to be some magic equation that's going to convince everybody. And there isn't. You know, I don't think that a lot of the reluctance to accept climate change, I don't really think that's about the science. I think that's about values. I think that's about the sort of deep story of how people see themselves.
Well, that's the scientists responding. Listen, it's not more science that you need. It's about the deep story of how people see themselves. Well, we might ask, how does Harvard see itself? Is it going to, in fact, take into account the new spring? Well, fascinating self-presentation. That's part of their publicity. Again, you can find it on Transition Studies, but you can find it on YouTube. They put it up as YouTube. We are Harvard. Okay. The one slide that you saw there twice, because it was used twice, was leadership, suggesting through their own publicity that Harvard is leadership. Now, this is the one thing that Tim DeChristopher, you may recall, was asking for from the president and from the corporation, and said that they've not shown it. So is Harvard showing leadership on something as important as the future that their graduates have to face? Well, if you listen to Drew Faust's interviews, she loves to talk about leadership, the importance of it, and how she's pursued it and underscored it and emphasized it throughout her years at Harvard. And sure enough, there are lots of School of Public Health interviews and everything else about the president on leadership. But what does she do? Not only say, but what does she do? Well, within a week of leaving Harvard as president, she joins the board of directors of Goldman Sachs. Is this what's meant by leadership? Well, apparently so. Faculty have been demanding leadership for quite a while. And they specifically want it on the question of divestment. Take a look.
Momentum is growing in the movement to divest from fossil fuel companies. On Thursday, South African Archbishop Desmond Tutu voiced his support for an anti-apartheid style boycott and divestment campaign against the industry for its role in driving climate change. In an article published in The Guardian, Tutu wrote, "People of conscience need to break their ties with corporations financing the injustice of climate change. We can, for instance, boycott events, sports teams, and media programming sponsored by fossil fuel energy companies." Tutu went on to write, quote, "We can encourage more of our universities and municipalities and cultural institutions to cut their ties to the fossil fuel industry." Last year, Desmond Tutu appeared in a video backing the fossil fuel divestment campaign.
The divestment movement played a key role in helping liberate South Africa. The corporations understood the logic of money even when they weren't swayed by the dictates of morality. Climate change is a deeply moral issue too, of course. Here in Africa we see the dreadful suffering of people from worsening drought, from rising food prices, from floods, even though they've done nothing to cause the situation. Once again, we can join together as a world and put pressure where it counts.
In other divestment news, nearly 100 members of the faculty at Harvard University released an open letter Thursday calling on the Ivy League school to sell off its interest in oil, gas, and coal companies. Harvard has the largest university endowment in the country, worth over $32 billion. The Harvard faculty letter was published just 3 days after the university's president, Drew Faust, rejected earlier calls to divest from fossil fuel firms. Instead, Faust announced the school would become a signatory to the United Nations-supported Principles for Responsible Investment.
In the letter, the professors write, quote, "If the corporation regards divestment as political, then its continued investment is a similarly political act, one that finances present corporate activities and calculates profit from them. The only way to remain neutral in such circumstances is to bracket ethical principles even while being deeply concerned about consequences. Slavery was once an investment issue, as were apartheid and the harm caused by smoking," the Harvard professors wrote. Well, to talk more about the disinvestment movement, we're joined by two guests. James Aronson is professor of chemistry and earth, and James Anderson is professor of chemistry and earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University, one of the signatories to the letter urging Harvard to divest from the fossil fuel industry. He's done groundbreaking work exposing the link between climate change and ozone loss. He's joining us from Harvard's campus. And with us in Washington, D.C., Jamie Henn, co-founder of 350.org. Professor Anderson, why don't you begin? Talk about why you signed this letter and what exactly it says.
Well, I signed the letter because this fossil fuel question is unique in many ways. First, the combustion of fossil fuels has and will continue to bring serious and irreversible change to the structure of the Earth's climate. And second, the fossil fuel industry has and will continue to provide very significant misinformation about this problem to the general public. The third issue revolves around leadership that I believe all universities should execute, and that was best captured really when President Bok divested from the tobacco industry, and Harvard responded similarly to the apartheid question. And in the case of climate change and its relation to energy, this is the most serious problem facing this and subsequent generations. And so I believe it's crucially important for universities to step forward and exhibit leadership, because if they don't, who will? The government is now crippled by both misinformation and special interests, and in many regards the business industry should not necessarily be expected, although we would hope they would, to exhibit leadership in this matter.
Well, yeah, the business sector doesn't exhibit any leadership in this regard, and since that time, 2015, there's been an extraordinary shift in government, but nothing on the university level. The shift in government has been in the direction of denying climate change. Well, you can ask, what do we really learn from universities in times of global crisis? And we've discussed this before in Cambridge Community Television. Basically, at a place like Harvard, and in this case, among other things, we learned that despite faculty protests, hundreds of people putting their names on a petition for the president to change its point of view, the administration responds basically like a corporation, because it is a corporation. And if you look at the hidden history of Harvard, you can learn that very quickly. Take a look.
It's part of a community of the military, the government, corporations, and educational institutions. So it creates certain kinds of knowledge very well, and others very badly when its main role is justification.
You go into Oxford and Cambridge, and part of the elite, you just have inculcated into you the understanding that there are certain things it wouldn't do to say, or for that matter even to think. And that's the primary, that's the indoctrinating function of the universities.
Harvard today is more of a business than a university. It's more of an arm of the military than it is of intellectual freedom. This is a sad commentary on the state of the United States.
Take a look at it. Brand new film, 2011. That is to say, it's still less than 10 years old, and it's in fact available. Okay, you could ask, well, what's coming now? The new leader, we have a new president. Drew Faust is no longer here. The question is, will the new president make any difference? After all, what have we learned about universities in times of crisis? Well, we've learned that they're part of a larger educational system in America, which Chomsky has summarized very succinctly and eloquently about its being a system of indoctrination as much as inquiry. Students can protest all they want. The question is whether it's going to make any difference, and whether this class in 2019 in Heat Week is going to be anything different than the exchange that occurred before any of the current undergraduates were on campus back in 2015. It's an open question, but it's something we ought to look at very carefully in the coming weeks as the season changes and the people change.
you.